Hi, David.
Is that Angeles?
Yes, it's me, Maria Angeles. Yes, I just want to know how we can organize several things before people join the webinar, because we will need me and probably Michelle to be co-hosts. So when Michelle joins the meeting, you will have to become her a panelist as well, please.
Okay. I've made, I think, let me see. I've made you panelists,
Yes.
but I haven't got Michelle as a panelist yet.
No, because she didn't join the meeting yet, but just to let you know that it would be easy for us if she is also a panelist too.
Okay. Yeah, you're a panelist now.
Yeah.
So it should be fine. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's Michelle. She's in the meeting now. So we'll just make her a panelist. Okay, so Michelle is now a panelist, Angeles?
Yes.
Good. And I guess everybody's in the webinar, right? So it's good. We're pretty well ready to go.
This is perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
So you are already recording, right, David? Yes.
I'm already recording. Yeah, we've got, yeah, everybody seems to be in the webinar, so that's good. Yep. And you're going to do an introduction, Angeles?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Thanks very much for doing this. It's great.
Our first experiment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Fantastic. And a large turnout too, so that's great.
And do you know Barbara Barta, that is the ACR, she will need to be a panelist also for a few moments just to advertise seal. So I don't know if I don't know if she's here yet.
Oh, who is it? Sorry.
Here is Barbara Barta. I will write the name.
Yep.
So. She must be a panelist too for a few minutes, please.
Yeah. No, we'll make her a panelist. Just send through the name. I didn't quite pick it up. That's all. I'm just looking for, if you can just type the name. Oh. Okay, we've done that, Angeles. So maybe if you want to start the introduction. Yeah.
So it's okay. So now I go ahead.
Great, thank you.
Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. Barbara Bartra the ECR of Education, and me, María de los Ángeles González Agrario, Vice President of Education, welcome all to the first workshop organized by the SEAL Education Committee. First, we would like to thank David Hamilton. It is a great honor for us to introduce him and begin the Education Workshop Seminar Series with his contribution. First, Barbara will share with you the benefits of becoming a SEAL member, and after that, I will introduce David Hamilton. Barbara, please.
Okay, hello everyone. I also welcome you at this event. As Maria said, I'm Barbara Barta, one of the early career representatives at SIL. And while we're waiting for everyone to join, I would like to invite all students to visit the SIL website after the workshop, so you can learn about the opportunities for you. We have the student competition, where the winner will be able to present their work at the next SIL Congress in Brazil. We also have the Tonoli and the Wetzel Awards, which fund research and also travel. And we have a fairly new program, the mentorship program, which is aimed at students from developing countries. We pair students with more experienced researchers who can help with your research and also with career development. So please check out the website and also become members so you can join the SIL community. Thank you and enjoy the workshop.
Thank you, Barbara. David Hamilton is the Director and Professor in Water Science at the Australian Rivers Institute, Griffith University. He has held positions across engineering and environmental sciences at the University of Western Australia, biological sciences at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and at the Australian Rivers Institute. He was the chair in lake restoration at the University of Waikato in New Zealand from 2002 to 2017. The culmination of this work was the Lake Restoration Handbook, a New Zealand perspective, published by Springer in 2019. Hamilton was a foundation member with 3 others of the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, LEON, with more than 800 members globally. He has been involved in water policy development at regional and national levels in New Zealand. He is a past president of the New Zealand Freshwater Sciences Society, editor-in-chief of Inland Waters, and holds associate editor positions for several other aquatic journals. David Hamilton has published more than 300 papers. His research interests are in cyanobacteria blooms, coupled physical and biogeochemical models of lakes and nutrient dynamics. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your knowledge and time with us. So go ahead, please.
Thank you, Angeles, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to people today. There's been more interest than what I would have anticipated. And so it's a little bit unfortunate that we won't have a lot of time for feedback from the audience, but please feel free to write your questions. And Angeles and Michelle will be taking those questions, and then we can collate them and go to some of the questions, maybe during part of this webinar, but also at the end as well. So we will take a little bit of a break and give an opportunity for some feedback from people, and hopefully that will provide you with a little bit of a chance to get up, stretch your legs, and listen to some of the questions during this time. So I'm assuming that you can see my screen okay at the moment. It should have the main title page on it, which has the topic of this webinar, which is Avoiding Rejection, How to Negotiate the Science Review Process. And so I'll be covering quite a lot of different aspects of publishing during this webinar, and I hope it might be useful to you. Many of you will say, well, I already knew that. We'll test that out during the webinar, and I'll ask some questions on Mentimeter when we sort of take a little bit of a break about halfway through this seminar, this webinar. Just a little bit about me. I have had quite a lot of editorial experience over the years. I'm currently the editor of Inland Waters, which I have been for about 4 or 5 years, and I've also served on editorial boards. Just for your information, what are editorial boards? Well, typically a journal might appoint anywhere from typically 10, maybe through to 30 or 40 people who have some experience in the field of the topic area of the journal, and those people will provide expertise by handling the peer review process on behalf of the journal, and also providing input at editorial board meetings that are held typically annually through the process. In my editorial experience, I've also handled quite a few special issues or special sections of journals. And so some of those are for hydrological processes, ecological engineering, hydrobiology, biologia, I should say, and inland waters. And if you are thinking of going onto an editorial board, then a useful thing to do is to become an editor of a special issue or a special section in a journal. Often it's done with 3 or 4 people that might get together, and essentially their role is to act as the equivalent of an editorial board member in handling the peer review process on behalf of the journal. Of course, it's also a very useful way for you to be able to promote some of your own research, and to be able to work with people who are working in the area, in the topic area of the special issue, to promote that research. And if you really want to be challenged, then you can go and try being an editor of a book. Often at the end of these processes, I look back and I say, well, I'm never doing that again. It can be quite time demanding, and it's coordinating a large number of people. But I seem to go back to it after a while and do it again. So we won't open up the Menti meeting yet, but I'll come back to this slide. So you don't need to go to Mentimeter yet, but what we will do is run a little bit of a poll halfway through, and we're going to ask you a series of questions. So one of those questions, for example, just to get you thinking about it already, is why on earth would you bother to publish? And I'll outline the answer to that, or some of the possible answers to that, in the forthcoming slide. But we will go back to this slide later on, and essentially get you to add to the poll, and let's have a look at that in real time during the meeting. Before I get too far into the seminar, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their ancestors past and present. And I extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples, in this case around the world. So why would you bother? And here are just some thought pieces for you to think about why you would publish. One of them might be notoriety. You want to essentially make an impact in the world. So that what is the metric for that notoriety? And in this case, it might be around citations primarily. People that will pick up your work and put it in their own, essentially in their own reference list. Scientific impact, and that's mostly around originality. Is the work that you're going to publish going to be original? Is it new? Is it novel? Those are the fundamental questions that you have to ask in terms of scientific impact. Believe it or not, a lot of people enjoy writing. And if you poll across a large number of people, of course, then I guess you'll find various answers to this question, but it can be very enjoyable to write and to see the outcomes of your research as a published paper. And of course, in terms of working towards your career and your qualifications, then as we know, the publish or perish phrase is still very much at the forefront of dictating your career in research and academia. And so here's just an example of something from Google Scholar, which is that you'll have the title and authors displayed. You'll have, of course, how many people have, or how many times the work has been cited, and also the year of publication. And essentially what the people are able to do is, of course, build up their record of the number of citations, which ultimately allows you to calculate an H-index or an immediacy factor, an immediacy index. And of course, those are, rightly or wrongly, those are very much linked to the sort of outputs that you generate for your career. I don't want to go into too much into the detail of that. That's perhaps another topic. Now, if you think about citations, you really do, of course, want to get your work cited. Now, journals use the number of citations over a 2-year period to determine the impact factor. And so it's the total number of citations that a journal gets over a 2-year period, divided, of course, by the number of articles to get their impact factor. Now, here's just a distribution of a typical journal, which is the number of times that an article is cited and the number of items. And what you can see is that there's actually quite a large tail or a large distribution, which are really cited a very limited number of times. You don't want to be in this on the left-hand side. You want to be up on the right-hand side. And I'll just illustrate that a little bit more with the forthcoming slide. So here's a large journal. Remember that 2 years, the journal impact factor timescale. And some journals will, or often you'll see a 5-year journal impact factor as well, which of course is the number of articles cited over 5 years. But again, just to illustrate that sort of long tail. So I'm guessing around 600 or 700 articles here as total. 320 of those weren't cited over that 2-year period. You don't want to be in this category. And 271 cited one time. So it's really critical that you get early citations as much as possible, and that your work is obviously going to be relevant to the scientific community. And ideally what you want to be is up in the top for the number of cites. So you can see one paper that is obviously cited 32 times during this period. So you know, that paper is now being circulated widely. It's being picked up by many of the authors, and fantastic for the authors involved to have 30 citations after 2 years. 32 versus 320 that never got cited. The publishers are very keen on citations for obvious reasons, because it determines the impact factor, and the publishers are very much looking at, okay, how many times are these papers being downloaded? What is the top cited article in the period that we might be looking at for the number of citations? And also the altmetrics attention. So altmetrics being an alternative social media index of the paper, and increasingly being used as a sort of metric of impact of that paper. And so you've got downloads, citations, altmetrics scores, and these things are pretty closely correlated. There's still a little bit of a discrepancy between altmetrics scores and top citations, but in general, if you are going to push out your paper in social media, it's generally an indicator that the authors are doing the work that actually helps promote the number of citations of their work. So it is important, and it can help with that number of citations. You'll also see some key sort of metrics of the journal on the bottom right-hand side. And that might be the median days submission to first decision, the median days acceptance to online publication, for example, the acceptance rate, the quartile of the journal. So these are important metrics for a journal. Obviously, what you want to be able to do is be submitting to a journal that will give you a fairly quick decision, and obviously get that paper into publication as soon as possible. And so obviously the top journals have a pretty low acceptance rate and often a very high impact factor. So you have to be able to align the quality of your work with some of those key metrics. If it's a fairly average piece of work, you're simply not going to get it into Nature as one of the top impact factor journals, which has a very low acceptance rate. So there is this key element of being able to align the content of your paper, the quality of your paper, with the journal that you're actually going to submit to. Now, what are those quartiles? The quartiles, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, are basically alignment of the top quartile of impact factor, and so on down to the bottom quartile. So generally, of course, you're going to want to submit where possible to Q1 journals, because you think that your work has quality, but you also have to be realistic about, it may not be necessarily a piece of work that is groundbreaking, and you may have to align the work with the journal appropriately. As I mentioned, impact factors all critical, of course. And again, I say rightly or wrongly, there are flaws in the system. No one denies that, but there's still a very key metric. A colleague of mine also said there's impact and there are impact factors. And you don't necessarily have to go to the highest impact factor to draw a lot of citations. If the title draws people in, if the work is relevant, and if it's high quality, you can get many, many citations from a journal that might have an intermediate impact factor. So the impact factor should not be the only criterion that you use to be able to see or determine where you're going to submit your work. And here, for example, is just what publishers look at very keenly at the end of each year, or when the output comes out, and that is the journal impact factor and how it's trending in a journal. And that's just another example of that, the journal impact factor trend, and obviously that journal impact factor determines whether it's a Q1 or a Q2. So I think the cutoff here in this case, 2021 for this particular case, was an impact factor of 3, and I think to break into a Q1, it was around 3.1 or 3.2 for that journal impact factor. So from the publisher point of view, they need your work, and you need your work to be cited. And when you look across some of the top cited articles, there are some commonalities. Again, altmetrics are important. Remember, it's not a retweet that actually gets your work counted in an altmetrics score. It's actually an original tweet, or it's an original piece of social media or general media that will get you an altmetric score. So there are a number of factors that come into play in that altmetric score. If we look at some of the top cited articles, this was 2020, you can see that there is a little bit of a common theme here. They're relatively simple, straightforward titles. They're very highly topical. Remember that this is just one journal that I'm showing. Okay, so this journal tends to have a little bit of a shall we say, a bias towards lakes and towards the ecology of lakes. And so, but there are some common things, things like, I guess, carbon, nutrients, biodiversity, and in some cases, sustainable development goals are things that are very important are the sort of things that people look for. And so they're really looking for titles that might have a relevance to what is topical for what they're looking for. So some common themes, just to emphasize that: nitrogen and phosphorus, conservation, biodiversity, metabolism. These are key words. Now, you can't manipulate your paper necessarily to have a whole string of keywords, but you do need to think about the title very carefully. What I've found is that perhaps novice or authors or some that are less experienced tend to have very long titles. And often it's quite an effort to sort of get through and understand that title. The titles that are simple and clear, that contain some of those key words are really what people tend to pick up. And so it is very important that you think carefully about that title. And as I mentioned, downloads a sign of upcoming citations generally. So what happens? Well, you can see the nitrogen and phosphorus limitation paper by Stephen Maberly and co-authors had a large number of downloads. It's no surprise, of course, also that paper was one of the top cited articles. I'll talk also about the open access aspect of this as well towards further on in the seminar. Altmetrics, there we go. The nitrogen and phosphorus had the most downloads. It wasn't necessarily the most had the top altmetrics attention, but the one that did had climate change and eutrophication in its as part of the title. So just to emphasize that point, that some of these are very topical. They're also almost areas that I guess the community, the public at large would pick up and understand. So it's not just scientifically, it's also in general text that we want those articles to be picked up by having those critical keywords that are simple to follow through on and topical. So now you want to be able to submit your work. One of the key aspects of this is do your homework on the journal early on. What's the journal quality? As I said, it's not just about impact factor. It's also very much about the relevance to your paper. And if you're starting to cite some of the articles in that journal, it's probably a good indication that the journal that you're selecting is probably the right one. Journals, however, themselves must be careful about self-citations, and that is that they're not citing the same articles in the journal over and over in their journal. And if that becomes too high a percentage, it's a sign, one, that the journal is probably of lower quality, and two, that they might get excluded from the impact factors So the percentage of self-citation by the journal itself is important. You need to assess how long the papers are. You can do counts in the journal of how many figures and tables there are, and you'll actually find there's quite a uniformity in many of the journals. Typically, there might be eight figures or so, 2 or 3 tables. And so do your homework on the length of the paper, the figures and tables, and also have a look at what is the balance of for example, the word counts in the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. And follow that logic, and be strict and be hard on yourself about where you allocate the text. For example, I often see elements of objectives popping up in the methods. That's not appropriate. The objectives or the aims of the paper and the hypotheses are usually confined to the last paragraph or 2 of the introduction. Don't put them up in the methods, and don't put elements of other things like discussion into the results. I guess I've also tended to see for some of the novice authors this idea of combining results and discussion. And I won't say that that's a no-no, but I would say that it does tend to happen in the more inexperienced with the more inexperienced authors. And I think it's a really good idea where possible, and if you can, to separate out the results where you're talking about what you see from the discussion where you're talking about why you saw what you saw. Have a look also at the number of references used in the paper, used in papers in the journal. You know, is it 20 or 30? Is it 100? And that almost automatically limits you as you go to write the paper to saying, well, I'm not going to do a complete literature search here and bring in 150 references. I'm really going to bring in the key 30 or so references that are relevant to this paper. Look at the abstract early on, see how many words it is, and that also confines you to very early on to knowing just how much you have to write. And one of the things as an editor that frustrates me enormously is people who have not properly read the instructions for authors. And that speaks a little bit of the quality of the paper and the quality of the authors, that whether or not they've even bothered to read those instructions in detail. They are important. They dictate the way that you put together the references, the conformity of those references to the journal style, the length of perhaps the introduction, the abstract. There's a lot of really good information that's often contained in the instructions for authors, and yet people just, in many cases, do not read them. I did want to just say, be careful. Be careful about where you submit. And here's an example of something that I received just the other day, asking me and actually sending me the paper and asking me to review a paper. So we request you to accept this manuscript for review purpose and send the comments in the stipulated date. So I wanted to just think about this and thought, this is a little bit unusual because there are no links to whether or not I accept the article to review, and there's no editorial manager system also. If you think there's something unusual about the journal, there probably is. And I just pulled up an example here and looked at this in a little bit more detail, thinking that would I review this paper or not? And it's what we'd call potentially predatory publishers, journals, or meetings that you have to be pretty careful And so here are some of the tips for just considering which journal you might submit to. APCs, the author processing charges, can be unusually high or low. So many of these journals will offer you open access, but they'll also charge a lot of money for that open access. Issue covers that have clip art, promises of extremely short peer review turnaround, short publication times, few or no published issues online, very few articles per issue, and unfamiliar, or often no, impact factor. They might give an ISSN, but they won't have an impact factor. So it's just a little warning to be careful. Most of you know the journals that you will submit to and where you are reading most of your papers, but there is a small word, especially for novice authors, to be careful about their first submission. I wanted to do a little bit more homework on this journal, for example, and see what the impact factors are and whereabouts it was ranking among other journals. And it's also unusual that, of course, I would be asked to review in a topic area that I wasn't familiar with. And so I did my search, and of course, this is what I found. So that was a little aside. Let's go back into having a look at really what we would call plan for writing a paper. So this is only my reckoning, but it may be useful to you. And it is a little bit formulaic in what I'm presenting here, but for people that are new to the process, this sort of formulaic approach might be useful. And really what you can do is you can break an abstract into, for example, different sentences that you have to write. 1 to 2 sentences introducing the topic, the objective somewhere in there, or hypothesis. And I find it very useful to think of the best papers that I see often put a sort of scientific test. And that scientific test speaks of the novelty of the work and what the paper is trying to really achieve. 3 to 4 sentences on the methods, 3 to 4 sentences on the results, a summary of the results, or some discussion, and then a conclusion about the wider implications of the study. You can also break out the introduction into 8 or 9 paragraphs, maybe. Have a look again at the journal you're submitting to and see what the standard is. And use what we'd call the wine glass approach. So the wine glass approach is designed to say that at the top of the wine glass, where it's larger, you're encompassing a large amount of the literature. So you're really trying to demonstrate to the reviewers of this paper that you know the field well, you know the general aspects of some of the key papers, you're familiar with that work. And of course, don't forget the most important paragraph in the paper, which is often the last one of the introduction, which is the objective and scientific hypothesis paragraph. Really, really important. That defines the scope of your paper and tells the audience about the novelty of the work that you're going to be doing. Ask yourself about the methods. Can a new reader, for example, follow the steps that you took? Just as an example, again, you'd use usually a wine glass approach. The study site at the broadest, the duration and frequency of sampling, for example, and then you'd get into some of the details, or what I've said, true methods following that, and maybe a paragraph or so at the end, which would have the statistics that you used in the methods. Results, typically it might be 8 figures and 3 tables, but check the journal, and that addresses the scope of the paper. You're not going to throw everything in your thesis, for example, into the paper. So have a look at how many figures, how many tables, and that will define the scope of your paper. discussion, make notes along the way, revisit the objectives and scientific tests, and think about someone on the other side of the world. Are they going to be interested in this paper? Or is it just a study of local relevance? If it's a study of local relevance, perhaps it's better as a report or maybe a regional or national journal. If your work is going to be relevant to someone who's sitting on the other side of the world, even if it is a local or regional study, then the answer is yes. Go ahead and write up your work. The title, I've already spoken about the title, you know, and I won't say any more about the title. Really, really important. There's lots of really good material that's available to help you, and that material has been in the form of, for example, simple rules. There are books written on publishing papers, and the publishers themselves have been very active in trying to help and promote you to be able to promote their journal in being for you to be able to publish in that journal. So getting published. Here's just a few hints. Read many papers, learn from both the good and the bad work of others. So what's the difference between a paper published in a high impact factor journal and pick some of the worst or lowest impact factors, or maybe some that don't even have an impact factor? Be very clear about how you differentiate the quality of a paper. You've got to be objective about your work. Rule 2. The better that work will ultimately become, the better that work is, ultimately the better the outcome. Sorry, that wasn't quite finished properly. But how do you get objectivity about your work? Well, you might have a supervisor, you might have a peer. Those people can be really, really valuable to you by sending the paper to them before you submit. So get as much or many reviews as you can on that paper to help you and to be able to actually be quite honest with you about, is this work really worth publishing? What can be done to improve it? So good pre-reviewers, rule 3, will be objective about your work, and it will be tough. If they're good peer reviewers, then they're going to level some criticisms at you, and you're going to have to be able to respond in an objective way to that. This one's pretty obvious. If you don't write well in the English language, take lessons early. I'm one of the fortunate ones that has English as the native language, and it's always a struggle, even when you have English as the native language. In fact, I know a lot of people that don't have English as the native language and have been trained and actually write extremely well in papers. And so, you know, it is a disadvantage, but it's one that you just simply have to work with, and probably have to also ask some of your English-speaking colleagues if the language is not good. The journal will do some copy editing and some English editing for you, and so will the peer reviewers. But if it's a lot, it's really going to detract from your ability to get that paper across the line in terms of getting it successfully peer reviewed and accepted. Rule 5, you have to learn to live with rejection. Sorry about that, but it's a fact of life. I once published with a colleague who proudly told me, well, I once worked with a colleague who proudly told me that he'd never had a paper rejected. And that was until he started working with me. We submitted a paper and it promptly got rejected. So whether or not I was the omen, but the fact is that we all get rejections. And obviously these ingredients of good science are obvious. Novelty. Novelty is really important. It's no good just simply repeating the work of others unless you are doing a review or a perspectives paper. So you have to identify the novelty of your research topic. You have to be able to say, someone on the other side of the world will be interested in this topic. You've got to cover the relevant literature, show that you're well versed in that literature, good data, good analysis, strong statistical support, and a thought-provoking discussion. Those are all the elements of a good paper. And when you think about the good analysis, that's a key point, because you don't want to be presenting in your results a whole lot of raw data. Remember that the publishers actually have costs usually based on page charges. So the days of putting a whole lot of raw data into a paper are basically gone. What they're looking for is synthesis and analysis of your results to go into a concise and condensed paper. Rule 7, start writing the paper the day you have the idea. So get that paper set out from the start. Get the abstract, get the introduction. Just don't necessarily keep plugging away with the analysis. As you do that analysis, you should be doing the writing, and writing is a skill. It requires a lot of work to become skilled at, like anything. You hear about the tennis player that needs to do 10,000 hits with the tennis ball. Well, the same it applies to writing. Remember that what I've seen is that novices may try to include everything they know in a paper. I had the rather unfortunate task of rejecting a paper fairly recently by a PhD student, but it was just simply that there were around 15 tables and 25 figures. It was just way too much. It was never going to be published in the journal. It was such an outlier to any of the others. As I've said, be familiar with the guide to authors, maintain a good bibliographic database, and remember to alter that bibliographic database according to the journal that you're submitting to. Rule 8, become a reviewer early. That's actually really critical, because it puts you on the other side of the fence and says, now I'm evaluating someone else's work for the quality of that work. And you can learn a lot from becoming a reviewer. Decide early on where to publish. That will help you define the scope of the paper. And remember that the quality is everything. So if the paper is well written, if the analyses are good and solid and statistically supported, if the discussion is thought-provoking, you have the elements of quality. As I said, quality is everything. The title and the abstract sell your paper. Easy to find keywords. Don't repeat the keywords from the title. Use different keywords so that it will be picked up. Authorship. This is a really tough one for perhaps novice or relatively new authors, but it has to be discussed early on. You've got to discuss it with the team and your potential co-authors. So be really open about this. And I'll point you to a paper on the bottom right, 10 Simple Rules for Collaboratively Writing a Multi-Authored Paper. And one of the key 10 simple rules, of course, is that you have to discuss the authorship early on. People will get very upset if they believe that they've contributed to your paper and find themselves either in the acknowledgements or perhaps not appearing at all. So it has to be made clear and explicit to all of those authors exactly what their role is at the earliest possible stage and the expectations of those authors. That was also another factor in the 10 Simple Rules for Collaboratively Writing a Multi-Authored Paper, is that it has to be very explicit what is expected of the authors. And one of the things, unfortunately, that we see is that names are added to some papers, and often I can tell that that person has not even seen the paper because of the poor standard of English that might be coming from that paper. So these are key things that you need to be aware of. And the last one's pretty obvious in terms of, make sure the work is original. Tables and figures. So I think of the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. You've really got to make these tables and figures as clear as possible. And you've got to take peer review on them early on before you submit. Make sure that someone else can understand easily the tables and figures. And so that's about the synthesis. Don't throw in a whole lot of raw data. Where possible, try to synthesize your work as best as possible. Don't forget simple things like the units. Everything has to be simple and clear. You don't need to try to cram everything into the page. And I sort of get annoyed with a lot of figures that use upper and lowercase in the figures. They'll use different fonts, they'll use different font colors, and they're just making the paper really messy for no reason. Or sorry, the figure really messy for no reason. So, try to avoid that. Try to avoid making unnecessary complexities when you're coming to figures and tables in the paper. As I mentioned, you can go to the publishers and they're there to help. They want to see your paper published. The editors want to see your paper published. Everybody wants to support you. So you must make use of all the resources that you have available. That can be your supervisor. It can be different reviewers beforehand. It can be the publisher themselves that provides a whole lot of material to help you. It can be in the guide for authors that is part of the journal as well. So yeah, make use of this as much as possible. So what I might do is we can, if you're sitting somewhere, stand up, take a break if you like. What we will do is I'll try to run a little Menti quiz, and we can see what we can do with getting some of your feedback there. And I can also deal with some Q&A, which I guess Angeles will be able to run. But first of all, let's see whether I'll stop my share now. One moment. If I can. Stop my share. Oh. Okay, so we'll try this Menti quiz. Anna, do you want to run it or shall I run it? Okay, so maybe I'll just try running the Menti quiz then. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see this Mentimeter quiz now. And I'm just going to go back to the start. So before you start filling it in. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Why do you wish to publish? So great to see some results coming in. So for those that aren't familiar with this, you go to menti.com and you type in the code that's at the top of the screen. Love seeing the fact it's fun to publish. That's great. I shouldn't I shouldn't presuppose or bias the results of this poll. Not to perish. Very good. Really like the ones at the top of the screen at the moment. Contribute to knowledge, foster the science. That's great to see. So publishing can become a very formulaic sort of thing. I love seeing the fact that we love science, we love our results, we love to get them out there. So yeah. Fantastic. Okay, I'll move on now to the next one. I hope. Okay, next question. What holds you back from publishing more? So we know that publishing is critical to our career. No data. Well, that is a problem. Yeah. If you don't have data. Yeah, one of the factors that I think is important when we start to look at this is one that I saw there, which is around own high standards or procrastination. And often, especially many PhD students are sort of driven to perfection. And that can actually be problematic. So by no means do I want to say that when I say that quality is everything, I certainly don't want to say that it has to be such high quality that it stops you from and slows you down immensely. So that certainly can be a factor and does hinder some people perhaps from getting as much work out as what they should. Okay, thank you very much. Still haven't worked out how to ease it forward. Okay, we will be talking about this in a little bit more detail, but it'd be really good to have a look at the next one. So this is a scales one. It's going to ask you, is peer review a good process? I like preprint service or peer review is too slow. Maybe, yeah. Yeah, there's a sort of catch-22 here, isn't there? That we go to a journal and we do peer review and consider, is this process a good one? At the same time, we're saying peer review is mostly simply too slow for what we'd like. Okay, so that's great. Thank you very much for doing that. I'm going to stop a share for the moment. and I'll go back to the remainder of the presentation that we have. So I'm hoping that you're back and can see the last slide that I finished with, which was resources. So let's move on to the outcome. You will be rejected, and we all have to learn to live with rejection, no matter what. But you can, obviously, as I've mentioned, do a lot to decrease, hopefully, the tears that follow with the rejection. I often think that we don't celebrate the success of our papers enough. It's a big deal getting your first one or few papers out. And remember, you have to act professionally. These are people often in the peer review process who've given up a lot of time, their own time, it's voluntary, and that you do need to put aside some emotional responses sometimes. Remember, many of us didn't take this career because of our writing ability, but quantity and quality of our writing will be very important in determining our career. I mean, fundamentally, most of us, I think, wanted to do new and original science. But the way that we are able to articulate that or get that science out there is very dependent on our writing ability. It requires practice. I do think rejection is only final when you give up. If you do get rejected, yeah, sorry, learn the lessons. Make sure you revise the paper thoroughly according to the peer review. And this was one that happened recently to me and my co-authors. And I did want to just say that we did respond. And I wrote back a letter which was really designed to be unemotive, but it did result in the paper being re-evaluated. And often, as an editor who first sees the paper, what I want to do is reject the paper. I don't want my associate editors or the editorial board to have to do a lot of work in reviewing a paper that's never going to get across the line and get accepted. So I'll be looking for reasons to reject it in general. So don't make some of the common mistakes that I've mentioned. But in some cases, we get it wrong. And you can argue the point. You can argue it in a professional way that clearly will make it possible for you to hopefully go back into the review process. So many of you will be familiar with this process, and that is, what is the workflow when your paper actually gets into a journal? So this is a sort of snapshot of what is typically done. It's not the same for all journals, but you can use it, I guess, as a template. So let's work through it. The author completes the submission on the editorial manager submission site. So as I've mentioned, pretty much all reputable journals nowadays will have an editorial manager system that you need to get a little bit familiar with. It's actually quite time consuming sometimes to upload a paper. And a few people get despondent about that and drop out. That's the first point of rejection. There's a technical check that's done to make sure that generally the paper conforms to what's required by the journal before it goes to the editor. Some people get despondent about that and drop out as well. The first proper evaluation of the quality of the paper in terms of the science is that the editor-in-chief will check the manuscript and determine whether it's suitable, and will reject the submission or will assign it to an appropriate associate editor for peer review. So as I've mentioned, this is not what all journals do, but it's what the majority would do. And that's the first point of rejection, is that about, for me, 40% of the papers are rejected. The associate editor conducts the peer review process, selects and invites reviewers. They might also choose not to proceed with the paper. They might say it's just not going to, it's not suitable, it's not of a standard that's good enough. So those peer reviewers will evaluate the paper, typically 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. And what happens is it'll go back after peer review to the associate editor, who then makes a decision. That decision might be to go back to the same or different peer reviewers, or it might proceed on. So the associate editor recommends a decision on the submission. And again, that might be rejection. And so some percentage of papers are rejected at that point, or it proceeds on. Now, don't get despondent about that peer review process. You've got to stay in it for the duration. And so those that do, and those that respond in a prompt manner and are vigilant about the process, generally will get their paper published. So it's all part of that peer review process. And remember, these are people that do it voluntarily and often are able to provide you with some really valuable feedback to improve the ultimate paper that will be published. Finally, it gets back to the editor-in-chief, who recommends a decision. So remember, all of that done by these people who are doing it voluntarily is designed to be as short as possible. And you'll see review requests that might ask you to get the review back in 7 days through to 1 month. So it can be quite time consuming. Once it's accepted, there's the remainder of the publishing process. And remember that you as an author have to be on top of this the whole way. So when you get back, for example, proofs, make sure you get them out immediately to all of your co-authors for them to have a look at and pick up any mistakes. Those are really important. And you know, the publisher can make mistakes, but also sometimes mistakes slip through the peer review process, but it might get picked up at the last minute. So be really careful about that. And you want to get the work out there as quickly as possible. So you have to be really responding rapidly through that process. There'll be a number of things that will be done. You'll get messages from the editor-in-chief, you'll get messages from the copy editor, and you'll get messages from the publisher. And they need to be responded to as quickly as possible to get your paper online as quickly as possible. I did just want to mention something about preprints very quickly. And these are seen as a method to be able to publish your work. So there are a number of preprint servers now. The publishers are putting out starting to put out preprint servers. You can put your paper up online. And then the idea is that, so you've got a Word document, you take it into a PDF, and then 2 days later, it's up online on a preprint server. And it will have a DOI. Remember that DOI means that it lasts forever. That paper that has not been peer reviewed will be up there forever. And it might look different to the paper that ultimately may or may not get published. If it's flawed, it'll be up there forever. In other words, if it didn't get picked up in the peer review process, that could be problematic. And in terms of impact factor or drawing citations for you, no, that doesn't happen. I'm just presenting some facts about the preprints. I'm not going to tell you yes or no. about whether these are good or not, but I will present some facts. Less than 10% of all preprints, that is the non-peer-reviewed preprints, received comments. The non-author comments were longer than the comments posted by other authors, but the median count for that feedback was 38 for non-authors and 18 for authors. So of the 10% that received comments, they might get back somewhere, maybe a comment with 30 or 40 words. There's a detail in the third point down. The study reports that less than 10% of preprints had at least one public comment. So you make the decision, but it's been problematic for me as an editor in some cases. And this is what some of the people have fed back to me about dealing with preprints. The authors provided no transparency until the paper was well into the review process. In other words, they provided no transparency about preprints, that something was online, or what they did in terms of what they had in terms of a preprint. Some reviewers will say the primacy of the final accepted version has been compromised. Early citations from a preprint server is a somewhat moot point because there's no impact factor. And maybe if the paper gets published later, will those citations substitute for a real impact factor related citation? And then a reviewer that says, I refuse to review a paper that is already online, has a DOI, and it is identical to the journal submission. So things have changed a lot over the last 20 or 30 years. We're using a lot of common data sets. We're sharing information much more freely and so on. But some people still draw the line with seeing published work up online, work on preprint servers, and then knowing that that work is also going through some other process. So some of the things that I do ask is, are the publishers really interested in the peer review process? What would happen if it was removed? Scientific societies and their conferences played a key role in a critical role in the peer review process historically, and that's to a much lesser extent now. But if you have a journal, and many journals are tied up with their scientific societies, many journals, and an increasing number nowadays, are there for profit motives. And so I would ask you to consider that when you consider to review a paper, perhaps, but you can support your society-based journal, for example, in that peer review process. And possibly open access has confused some of the peer review process. For example, author processing charges to have papers published. It's pretty obvious that in a journal with no impact factor, you pay $2,000 and you get your paper published. So this process is under threat, I believe. It's under threat from the publishers, and it's under threat from some of the motivations of some of the publishers in some cases. Not all, but in some cases. Get your published work out there. I've already spoken about altmetrics, but the work should not finish when the paper is published. The work actually starts in some ways there, because there's a whole new set of media that you might use to be able to talk about your work. You might do a blog, you might get it out to people in industry, you might send it to managers, you might tweet it, you might use a whole set of blogs and correspondence that helps to get your work out there. You must believe it's important, therefore make sure that they do. Academic publishing is a sort of a weird industry, yes. There's a lot of voluntary work that's done. The publishers take the final product and sell it back to the producers in many cases, or at least their institutions, with a little bit of packaging. And is academic publishing parasitic, feeding on the juiciest thoughts of the world's great minds? So I do ask you to think about the intellectual property that you have, the knowledge that you have. It's valuable. So make sure that everybody appreciates that. Should we be paid for all this voluntary work? Well, that's an argument that probably could be taken up after the seminar. Do I select open access? So you have to pay for open access. Excuse me. And that's something that can enhance the number of citations that your paper actually gets. It's maybe around 1.3, 1.5, 1.8 or so, depending on the journal, depending on the type of open access you make. But do get familiar with the different types of open access: bronze, gold, or green. They can be important, and so read up on that and take note of it. Here's just a little cartoon about open access. So the taxpayer pays for the lab and research. Yes, we give away our papers and often the copyright to the journal for publication. And it says that we then need to be funded again to read our own publications. So that's exactly what is done, that the journals, of course, ask us to pay, or through our institutions we pay. And we might also be paying author processing charges and making it open access, for example. You've got various options, as I mentioned: gold access, green access, bronze access. Do find out about those. They can be important when you select. One of the things that's happened over the past 10 or 15 years has been an expansion in the number of journals. That might be a good thing because we've now got more options to be able to publish our work. But why has this happened? It's happened because publishing is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. And there's some eye-watering figures that are given here for what those profits are like. And yeah, they're absolutely enormous. Many of the publishers are operating at a profit margin of 30 or 40% on their operating. It's hugely profitable. And remember when I said that our intellectual property is important. We've got the knowledge, we've got the IP that is immensely useful to these organizations. The number of journals will continue to expand, and I'm not sure where this is going, but I do know that I get many peer review requests, and quite how we as an organization or as a professional society handle that is, I guess, up for debate. Be careful is the message here. I won't talk in detail about this, but I guess you could Google this guy and find out what happened. You do need to be careful about the choice of open access and where you put your published work up in a public domain. And so that's relevant to things like ResearchGate. It's relevant to any of the repositories that you put your work up on. Do be careful, because it may not necessarily be open to everybody, and you might get a little tap on the shoulder from a publisher in some cases if you don't hold the copyright over that paper. So I hope I've given a little bit of time now for any questions, and I'm happy to address those questions. I'll stop my screen share. I'll hand over to Angeles and Michelle, I guess, and if there are questions, I'm very happy to try and address those. So thanks very much for your time and hearing me out here. I hope it was useful.
Thank you, David. It was very useful. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much for your time. We have a question from Adam Petrusek, and he says, can associate editors of inland waters reject the manuscripts without sending it out for reviewer, even when not rejected by the editor-in-chief?
Yes, the associate editors have, in fact, some do. So, you know, the review that I do, I really try to pick out papers that, as an editor-in-chief, that really aren't going to make it in the peer review process. But I do hand it to the associate editors, and it is again their choice to reject the paper at any stage, and that can be before or after the peer review.
Thank you. Any other question? I have a question about open access, because many journals are turning now to the open access, and I don't know what is your opinion, but I think that can exclude a lot of good researchers that cannot pay for an open access publication. So
yeah, thanks, Angelis, for the question. It's a really difficult one, and I did comment in one of the SIL newsletters about this some time ago. And what it's meant is that those that can pay often will or do, and those that can't often don't. And this creates a sort of a bias, in my opinion, and it's particularly difficult from those from emerging countries. You do need to check with the journal if you're from an emerging country, because there can be concessions given, either to waiving or to partially waiving some of the open access fee. But you know that it's not that common, and it's a really difficult one. I don't have any answers there, really. I'm sorry. It's just one of those facts of life that seems to, in my opinion, have made, again, brought about this disparity between those that can pay and are able to make it fully open access, and those that can't. And it's interesting too, because when you do the open access and you have a truly Creative Commons, you know, so you might have 2 or 3 nice figures in a paper. People are able to pick up those figures and put them actually in their own PowerPoint presentation, or in even their own paper, in some of the Creative Commons platforms. And so that again generates more impact and more citations of the work. So it's a rapidly evolving and really quite difficult field, actually.
thank you. We have another question from Sarma, and he says, even most experienced driver may crash his vehicle if close his eyes for a minute. Similarly, most experienced authors may get rejection of their work if not taken care of. It's more...
Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure what of the question, but
no.
I guess it is that, yes.
It's more a reflection, indeed, that we should all take care of all the steps we have to consider when we are sending a paper to a journal, I think.
Yeah, and I think it also says that, you know, sometimes the editor or the reviewers get it wrong. And if you strongly believe that, you know, take the rejection, but get the paper resubmitted somewhere else. Take note of what the criticisms were. Often the criticisms are correct, but, you know, sometimes they're wrong.
So here we have another question. So says Joseph Tate, so in general, do you advocate for preprint repository or otherwise?
Okay, I'll have to be careful what I say here, but well, one of the arguments that is made by authors is that preprints allow them to get their work. Their work is so important, it allows them to get it out there 2 days after the work is sort of finished and written up, versus 60, 90 days otherwise. And I can see a validity in that argument, but I just feel very sorry for people who've got that work out there, but it never gets published. I would say, you know, use a preprint server if you're really, really confident that the work is going to get accepted and get out there. But for me, I'm not going to use them personally. You know, in the medical field, it's more common to use a preprint server, and often the work gets published in the medical field, you know, in 3 or 4 weeks, as opposed to, you know, sort of our 90 days, 120 days till it's published. We generally just have to accept those timelines, I'm afraid, but yeah, it's quite a difficult one.
Thank you. Next question. What are your recommendations for meta-analysis papers?
Oh, I think absolutely. Meta-analysis papers are. Did Michelle want to answer this question? No. Sorry. So meta-analysis papers for sure. Get them out, but do your homework on whereabouts those meta-analysis papers are being published. So if there's a history of the journal publishing those papers, then by all means, absolutely, yeah. But do make sure that you identify the novel aspects of a meta-analysis. Yeah.
Next question. When preparing a manuscript, at what point do you decide on your target journal?
I would say, you know, as quickly as possible. So, you know, once you've written, or at least you know, the first thing is to set out your abstract, introduction, methods, just to have the section headings. Once you have those section headings of abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, references, then the next step is start identifying where your target journal is. And that can be done by discussion over sort of 3 or 4 weeks in the early stages of developing the paper. But yeah, develop up that idea of, you know, where is the target journal as soon as possible, as quickly as possible.
Can we get a fast publication as a still student member to publish in Journal of Inland Waters?
One of the things that we offered, and I've actually had to, what I hope I have, removed this now, was that we had a 30-day fast response, first response. So you'd find out whether your paper was essentially rejected, or that it was going through was able to go through the peer review process and was likely to be accepted. But that's caused huge difficulties for us, simply because when we go out to reviewers, some reviewers are just not conforming to that process. And I really wanted to remove it, just because I feel that we're not sort of being honest and able to conform to it. We're probably missing 30% of cases where we get that first response back in a month. I wish I could do better, but it can be important in your cover letter to be able to say, and certainly indicate that you are a PhD student and that you have certain timelines you want to meet. So don't hide the fact that you are a PhD student. For me as an editor-in-chief, I'm often sympathetic to people that are PhD students and that might want to get their work out there quickly. Yeah, but that's about the best that I can offer.
Next question. Shaswar Munich asked, thanks a lot, very useful. I have two questions. First, how do you become a reviewer? And second, could you say something about conflict of interest in peer reviewing? Okay, so the first part about becoming a reviewer is you can work with your supervisor or someone else that has experience with publishing and just sort of send them an email and say, look, I'd really like to get experience in peer review. And could you, when you're asked to review a paper, could you consider me and asking me to do the peer review? In that respect, it's really useful to actually work often, for example, with your advisor or supervisor to do the peer review, and there are, in fact, it's probably the topic of another seminar, but there are a whole lot of aspects to doing a good peer review, and so I'd really recommend trying to work with someone who might receive a lot of peer review requests. So for example, myself and many of my colleagues will get 2 or 3 or 4 peer review requests a week, and we'd be very happy to be able to delegate some of those to others, and hopefully they'd be able to benefit. A conflict of interest in peer reviewing is really where you might have authored, or one of the authors, one or more of the authors well. I like to think that, as a scientific society and as scientists, we might sort of know of someone, but we're able to differentiate and say, I'm doing this as a blind reviewer, and I'm simply going to look objectively at the science. Now we can sort of argue about that point, but yeah, the conflict of interest exists when, for example, there's someone in your lab, there's someone that you've co-authored with closely, or you know the work very well. Then to me, that is a conflict of interest. And it is a point that many journals will ask you to nominate some peer reviewers. So it's sometimes, and that can be a pretty tricky process, because you can't really nominate someone who, has had a very close association with your work, but you may perhaps nominate someone that actually knows you, but may not be familiar with the work. Ideally, you'd nominate someone that might have some vague, who will be working in the field that you're working in. They may or may not know you, but they won't know intimately of the work that you've been doing. Thank you. Michelle Gross asked, I have a question. Can David elaborate on how paper size impacts our chance of publication? Strategies on deciding whether to split one large paper into 2 smaller papers.
Yeah, so this is a little bit like cutting up the salami, right? How much can you cut it until it becomes too small to really be worthwhile to be able to publish. One of the features that I've seen is that papers are becoming more condensed. They're becoming more synthesis-like, and by that I mean that
they're not presenting a lot of raw data, they're presenting data that are synthesized. My recommendation for, particularly for novice or new researchers, would be don't try to be too ambitious. Don't put everything in there. So if it means cutting up the paper a little bit into a manageable chunk, then do that. And that then has the advantage, of course, that you might get a second or follow-on paper as a consequence. So that would be my recommendation. Don't throw everything into the kitchen sink and think that it's suddenly everything's going to float to the top and be easy. It won't be. And so cut it out into manageable chunks. Look for those opportunities, for example, of, in some cases, they're research briefs or even notes, short, discrete, sharp pieces of work. You've got a novel idea, get it out there. Yeah.
What Carla Munsner asks, what is a good way to convince journals to publish your negative results?
I've talked to other editors about this, and we don't discourage negative results at all. And what I'm talking about here is not results that have flaws in them because of methodology. They'll be rejected. But results that may not conform to or may violate the hypothesis that you went into. So, you know, I think it is important to publish those negative results. Most of the editors that I've talked to are quite happy to receive those types of papers. One thing about the papers is they shouldn't be too long. So don't try to tease out a very long paper with negative results. Make it short, sharp, and discrete, and get those results, those negative results, out there for people to see.
Mary Alencar asks, what are your opinion about the publication bias to significant results? Do you have tips to publish studies with no expected results?
So the way that I'd interpret this is it relates partly to the previous question about negative results, and that is, yes, you can publish them. It also relates to where you don't have significant, where, for example, you might have low P, significance values, or you might have just that you can't correlate any of the variables. So I do think you need to be a little bit careful about that from the point of view of the statistical analysis that you use and the fact that what you're looking at might just not be so relevant. And I say that from the statistical analysis point of view because, as we all know, if you've got 1,000 points in your data set, then you can still get a highly statistically significant result, but only explain 1 or 2% of the variation. And so we do need to be very careful about the way that we use the statistics. The percentage variation explained, I mean, I've looked at a number of papers and yes, they've got significant results, but those results are explaining 5 or 10% of the variation because they've got 500 or so data points. So be careful about that aspect of it. Look at the statistics carefully and critically.
We have another question. Is it harder to publish something as a first-time author? Does the amount of paper published by the authors matters?
Well, I'll take that in two ways. Is it hard for a first-time author? You bet. It's always hard to get that first paper out. And often it's just such a relief, perhaps as a PhD student, to get that first paper published. And you'll often find that it takes 4 or 5 times longer than the second paper. So you learn by experience. Does the number of papers published by the authors matter? I think there's probably some sort of a bias in that, yes, it does. And that is that, you know, where an author's published a lot of papers, generally people would look upon it and say, yeah, this work is probably going to be good and therefore it is good. So, yeah, there is a sort of I think some almost subconscious bias there. But it does raise a careful point about co-authors, you know, and co-authors should not be there as tokens. Co-authors should be there as people who can make a useful contribution to the paper. And sometimes you might invite a co-author who's very experienced and can help you make that critical transition of an average paper into a very good paper that gets accepted.
Okay, another question. Some journals reviewers reject more papers without giving details or reasonable feedbacks after waiting for several months. So what is your suggestions for authors?
Yeah, I find that really sad when I see that, and when I do reject them at editor level, I do try to provide, you know, a couple of paragraphs for why I am rejecting that paper. If you've been waiting a long time and you get the feedback and it's, you know, 3 or 4 sentences, then I find that really sad. It's something that I think many of us at editorial level, and to some extent the publishers, are thinking about how can we control the quality of the peer review process, because I've had reviews come back and there've been 1 or 2 sentences, and in those cases I sometimes write back to the reviewer and say, you know, how can this be? Why, when I've asked you to review the paper, can you only provide a sentence to say this is a good quality paper, or that this paper needs some revisions? That's not a review. And so, you know, if anybody has some suggestions about how we sort of deal with this, we're continually balancing, you know, that it is voluntary for the reviewers, but increasingly, because people are time constrained to a greater extent, the reviewers have tended to get shorter. And there is a country bias here. So a typical review that comes out of, I won't say what the country is about 37 words. A typical review that comes out of another country is around about 650 words. And what can we do? I'm a little bit stuck here.
Yeah. Daniela Cortez asks, what do you think of open review process as an alternative to single or double blind reviews?
Again, I don't have a definitive answer for this. I'm just a little bit concerned about the open review process where, as a reviewer, you have to be very respectful of the authors. You should never get personal. You should be careful about the way you frame a rejection. And in that rejection, you just have to be very objective. And you have to help. I always regard it that you should be helping the authors to improve and clearly justify, for example, a reason why you might reject a paper. But yeah, it's quite a difficult one, and I'm yeah. Would you mind? Angela is just repeating the last part of the question. I might have missed it.
Yeah.
It might have gone. Sure.
Yes, I'm trying to find it. Okay, let's see.
What do you think of open review process as an alternative to single or double blind reviews.
Yeah.
There it is.
And yeah,
Thanks, Michelle.
thanks for the prompt, Michelle. The part that concerns me a little bit is, is the author going to hold that reviewer accountable and say, well, they obviously don't like me, sort of, that's the part that I am concerned about. I think that the blind review works pretty well, but it does lend itself potentially to anonymity, a little bit like social media, anonymity being a vehicle by which you can say things that you wouldn't say to that person. And that's probably a point when we think about the review process, is to say you should, in this blind review, feel comfortable that you could actually say that to the authors personally, and maybe that would sort of get out of some of the occasional reviewer who does get personal, and I think that's very poor. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Do you think the reviewers should get at least some more formalized credit for their effort to help them in their career, to partly substitute that is in unpaid volunteer job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are different models for that. One of them would be that the publishers actually used some of their profits to pay for reviews. And that to some extent has been done there are some models of that already. At the moment, the publishers are so powerful and they control the editorial manager systems that it's sort of been difficult for us to have much weight. And as a professional society, I guess we do want to have our intellectual property valued. And so in that regard, it's a really good question. There are other models like Publons, where obviously you get a reviewer credit. And I'd like to see those done more and more, things like that. For us to have a simple process by which we are able to get recognition, clear recognition and feedback as a reviewer. Someone needs to work on that model. And the other one is where we get basically no credit at all. So, I don't know, for other journals, maybe 50 reviews a year, and basically get nothing for it. The publishers get something for it because they eventually get a paper that's published, and that they are able to, that's part of how they're able to push that particular journal publication. So really good question. I would definitely like to see someone thinking about how we get better credit.
Yes, I would say also, if you may allow me, that it is important also for the authors to acknowledge and thank the reviewers for their time, because many times they put a lot of effort and they feel sometimes anger for the feedbacks and don't acknowledge the time they spend doing the revision. So it is also important that, I think.
I agree totally, Angelis. It's people make fantastic suggestions through the peer review process. I think it's a very honourable sort of thing to do, and they're willing to give their intellectual contribution for nothing to making that paper better. So peer review is so important.
We have another question by Tariku. He asked, what is nobility in inland water research?
I'm not sure that I fully understand that question. Maybe if they want to retype
Yes,
detail about it. Yeah.
maybe. And while he does that, we can go to the following question. Louisa Mary von Blasco, sorry for the pronunciation, asked, what is your opinion on using frequencies versus Bayesian statistics for analyzing our results? Do you think that reviewers could reject a paper if the author used Bayesian statistics without justifying it very well?
Yeah, so if the reviewer didn't justify why they were rejecting Bayesian statistics, I think, in a word, no, that's wrong. And you'd have an argument to pick up with the associate editor or the editor about that, to be able to say, I was rejected because this person didn't like Bayesian statistics. So, you know, I think as long as you've formally identified the methodology of Bayesian statistics, for example, if you used it in a way that shows clearly how you've analyzed the results, yeah, there's no reason why a methodology should be rejected like that.
Well, the next question is, thank you very much for your presentation, says Simon Cardoso. I would like to know if you could give some guidance on how to judge a paper for a narrow, local, or broader interest, and how it is used on the decision making. Thank you.
So this really relates to what the question that I asked about, would someone in another country, you know, on the other side of the world, be able to get something useful out of your paper? And so no matter whether you do a local study or a regional study, some of the questions or hypotheses need to be framed so that they're relevant to the science and to someone evaluating that from somewhere else. If that isn't the case, then you'd have to say, well, it looks like it's just of local interest, and maybe it's better to be a report, or I can publish it in a sort of local or regional journal. If the hypotheses relate to some scientific novelty that's relevant to everyone, then yes, that local scale paper should be relevant to others around the world, and so it should be able to be of broad interest and go into a potentially international journal.
So that was our last question. I don't know if there is any more questions. It seems not.
Oh, there's one more, which is around
yeah.
Yeah.
So Tariku, he explains, novelty is one of the criteria for publication, as you had stated in your presentation.
Okay.
My question.
Sorry, Angela.
My question is, what makes our research novel in inland waters? Yeah,
and I apologize for if that's my accent or if it's the poor sound, but the word was novel, N-O-V-L, and so I'll just type that in and say it's related to novelty and new research. You know, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to promote work that is new and or novel to others, and so that was the point I was making there.
Okay. Well, if there is any more questions, then I think we finished with the questions. So and with the workshop, I understand. So I would like to really thank you for your time, David. It was a fantastic presentation with a lot of important recommendations for students and early research careers. So we are really thankful for and grateful for your time.
Thank you, Angeles, for organising it, and to Michelle and Barbara. I hope it was useful, and look forward to future seminars. So thanks everyone for attending as well.
Yes, thank you to all for attending. And for people that is not a SIL member, we invite you to visit our webpage at www.limnology.org. So thank you so much for everyone to attend this evening, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and see you soon on our next workshop or seminar of education. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.